web controls, page layout controls. In this nugget, we're going to talk about some of the controls associated with page layout, including the associated control ID property, file upload controls, the various navigation controls and sitemaps, and something called web parts. So let's start with associated control ID. That's an easy one. Okay. So on this page, I've added a label. Has text, name, and it's meant to be associated with this text box, which is where you would actually type your name. And so to create that connection, the label gets an associated control ID, and you give it the ID of the control that it is associated with. That produces the appropriate HTML when this is actually rendered to the browser, so that the browser can kind of attach those two for things like the tab order when someone tabs through the page. Sometimes some browsers will use that to provide voiceover cues for someone who's visually impaired and so forth. So if a label is going to be associated with some other control, then it's a good idea to use the associated control ID. The next bit I want to talk about is a little bit more complicated, and this gets into using the navigation controls. Now there are three navigation controls: menu, sitemap, path, and tree view. Tree view, well, you know what, you're going to see all of these. The sitemap path is commonly referred to as a breadcrumb. Kind of shows you a little trail of where you've been on the site and gives you an easy way to back yourself out to a previous level of the site's navigation hierarchy. All of this stuff starts by adding a sitemap to your path, to your web application, and this needs to be in the root of your directory. And it's a fairly simple XML file. The idea is you just create a sitemap node for every main page of your site that you want to be part of the formal navigation. And as you can see, you can nest these things to create sort of a hierarchy. Then I went into my site's master page and I did a couple of things. First of all, I added a sitemap data source. Now ASP will automatically load that sitemap and connect it to this for me. I just need to define this thing's existence and give it an ID, sitemap data source 1. The next thing I did, let's see, the next thing you're going to actually see is a menu control. I gave it that sitemap data source as its data source ID. CSS class, blah, blah, blah. The big thing here is that I've oriented it horizontally. You can do vertical menus as well. So I did start to go down the path of manually adding menu items to this menu, but as you're going to see, these don't actually show up. It's going to be overridden by what's in my sitemap. Now the next thing I did was create a sitemap path. That's the breadcrumb trail. You'll see that in a little bit. And I also added a tree view and gave it the sitemap data source 1 data source ID. So let's just save this whole kit and caboodle and run it so you can see all three of those navigation elements in action. Cool, huh? So here's that label and text box control. Here's my tree view, and it is based on the hierarchy that I included in my sitemap path. So I can compress these things, expand these things, whatever else. I haven't actually created all these pages. I'll actually sometimes get in, kind of map out my site, create the sitemap, and then having these links here is a good way to remind me of which ones I still need to create. Here's the home link for my menu, and when I hover over that, it automatically does the little flyout to create that same hierarchy. You can see that it is ignoring the manual items I put there in favor of the sitemap. So that's kind of a nifty little trick. Now the one thing you won't have seen in that little run through was the sitemap path, the breadcrumbing, and that's because I was already at the home level. So there was no need for that to show up. But those are your three main navigation controls that you can use to set up. Now, you can also manipulate all of those things programmatically. If you'd prefer not to create a sitemap, you don't have to. You can programmatically add and remove things from those menus. A benefit of having a sitemap, though, is that this is something that search engines can read. Search engines like Google and so forth can read this type of thing, and they can use that to learn about your site's navigation and structure to make sure that they crawl your site more thoroughly. So there's good reasons to have this kind of a sitemap, even if you're not using the navigation controls. But the fact that the navigation controls can pull from it and use it to automatically construct menus and tree views and a sitemap path, it's tremendously useful, really, really helpful. Now, if I flip back into IE where I've got this running and I click on About, so now I'm getting into my hierarchy, you can see there's the breadcrumb that shows up. It's showing me that this is the portion of the hierarchy I'm in, and this allows me to quickly click back at any point in the hierarchy. So really neat controls, really helpful to have those things all set up, and the sitemap path is the key to making it all, or the sitemap is the key to making it all come together. So the next little thing I want to talk about is the file upload control. I'm not sure why Microsoft categorizes this in the navigation topic, or the page layout topic of the exam, but they did. So we're going to talk about it. Let me just pop a file upload control in here real quick, and I'm going to call it up1 because there's going to be a little bit of typing going on here. Next thing we need to do is get into the code for this default page. So let's view the code. And I like to handle my file uploads in the page load. And there's two reasons a page might load. One is that someone's viewing it for the first time, and the other reason is that they've posted it back to the server and I'm supposed to do something with it. So I like to grab that. If is post back, then, and I'll do everything in here. So first of all, you need to decide where you're going to put these things. So I'm going to create a path, and I'm going to ask the server to actually get that path for me. And let's just say we're going to grab it from the site, and we'll call it uploads. So it's going to get me the actual physical path for that. The next thing I'm going to do is run some checks on this thing, but I'm going to assume that my checks are going to fail. So the first thing is if up1 has file, then. So if there is actually a file on this thing, then I'll go ahead. Dim extension as string, and then we'll set that equal to system.io.path.getExtension from up1.filename, and I want to make sure it goes into lowercase so that we're doing things consistently. So that's getting my file name extension. Now let's create a set of allowed extensions that we're going to support. So this will be an array, and we'll set it equal to doc.txt and .pdf. That'll be fun. So let's see here. For I as integer equals 0 to allowed.length allowed dot stop doing that on me allowed escape dot length, and it's right there, dim allowed as as string, sorry. If the extension equals allowed I, then file OK equals true. So we're just going to run through that set and decide if this is a file we're going to allow. So once we figured that out, if the file is OK, then here's how we actually do the upload. Up1.posted file, so we're going to grab the posted file, execute its save as method. We need to give it a path, so we're going to start with the path we want to save it at, and then we'll take the file name that was provided to us from the upload control. Things can go wrong there, so it's not a horrible idea to stick that in a little try-catch block. Catch X as exception, and then in here you can choose to do something about it, display an error message or whatever else. So that's how you process the thing. Keep in mind in terms of permissions that whatever your worker processes in IIS are running as are going to need permission to write to whatever path you have specified for this thing. If they don't have permission to, then nobody's going to be able to write to it. So that is how you do a file upload using the file upload control. All right, close all that. The last thing we're going to talk about is web parts, and I've actually done this up in my About page so I can show it to you. Let's see if we can get that open here. Ooh, let's get into the source. So you'll notice a bunch of these in the toolbox under web parts. So there's a bunch of pre-done parts. Appearance editor, catalog zone, editor zone, lots of zones. We're going to kind of stick simple. I do want to point you to a more complex example though. Here's the URL, msdn.microsoft.com/en-us/library/sk23dydw.aspx, just in case you want to go through that. The idea behind a web part is it's some, well, actually, you know what? The easiest way to think about this, let me show you. So this is Google's customizable modular homepage bit, and you've got all these different things that you can drag around on the page. You can rearrange these things. You can get little drop downs that give you verbs to edit settings and so forth. These, in ASP.NET terms, are web parts. Now I realize this Google page isn't written in ASP.NET, but this is the idea. These are little web parts. And you've got little zones that you can drag them into and so forth. So that's really what this is going to enable us to do. So here's what I've done. I added a web part manager to my page. That doesn't produce any visible output. It's just the code that makes all the web part stuff work. Then I created a table, and in that table's cells I created two web part zones, a sidebar and a main. Oops. Within the sidebar zone template, I added a label, and that's going to contain several links. And then I added a user control that I created, and that user control is actually part of this project, but what's in it is irrelevant. It's just layout. It doesn't actually do anything. There's no code. In the next zone, I just added a label tag. Notice that I've given it a title, content. This one has a title of my links. This has a title of search. So let's see what happens when I run this. You can hear the hamsters churning away. There we go. So there's the titles, my links, content, and search. It appears, and all of these things are little self-contained web parts. Now, of course, you can style these things, you can make them look however you want to. By default, you don't get the drag and drop and rearrange functionality. There's quite a bit more code that has to be wired up in order for that to happen. And that web page on MSDN that I just showed you will actually walk you through that entire process. And you kind of should make yourself familiar with how that works and what code is involved. But the basic idea behind web parts is to create these self-contained little units that a user can then edit. For example, on the search, I might have a little drop down with a verb that says edit, and then that pulls up a settings dialog, and the user can decide what their default search engine is going to be from this search box. Over here, maybe I give them the ability to add and remove links or change the link colors or something like that. So I can control their ability to change the appearance of the page, but give them the ability to change certain aspects of it, including rearranging the content and whatever other control I want to give them. So this is a really kind of advanced topic, definitely something that if you want to become familiar with it, experimentation is the way to go. There's that walkthrough on MSDN is a great place to start, and then they link off to the more detailed information. There are some difficulties with web parts. I mean, one of the reasons they get complicated is that in order to maintain your customization of the page, the site has to be able to identify you. Now that means your site is probably going to be using ASP.NET membership, or if it's an intranet, perhaps it'll be using people's Windows user account name. And you also need a personalization provider and database, so that once the system has identified who you are, it has a place to store your customizations, and that's what the personalization provider does. So web parts personalization is turned on by default. By default, it uses the SQL personalization provider, and Microsoft SQL Server Express Edition is installed along with Visual Studio to actually store that personalization data. So I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here, which is one reason it would be really good for you to walk through that walkthrough and learn about all those different elements and how they connect to each other, so that you can really kind of see where web parts go, and that you can understand some of the code that is required to make those bits work. In this nugget, we've talked about some of the different page layout controls and elements that are in ASP.NET. We looked at the associated control ID property of labels, and I showed you how to use the ASP.NET file upload control. We also looked at navigation controls, including that breadcrumb, which is the site map path control, the tree view, and the menu controls. Keep in mind that menu can be arranged vertically as well as horizontally, as in the example I showed you. And I showed you how all of these tie back into that sitemap file. Do keep in mind that your site navigation can be controlled programmatically. It's worth your time to look at some of Microsoft's MSDN library examples on doing so that you at least know the basics behind how to do it. But I love using sitemaps. We also looked at web parts. And again, I encourage you to go through some of the longer walkthroughs so that you can copy and paste some of the code Microsoft provides in their examples, so that you can really see how those work. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.